The winter of 1368 was bitter even by the harsh standards of medieval France. In the shadowed corridors of the Hôtel Saint-Pol in Paris, a cry echoed through the halls. A newborn had arrived into a kingdom already groaning under centuries of conflict. Charles, the son of Charles V and Joanna of Bourbon, was not just a child, but a symbol of a fragile lineage poised between triumph and disaster. The 100 Years' War had already begun to shape the destinies of kings and commoners alike, and the Black Death lurked like a shadow over every city, village, and hearth, ready to reduce life to dust. Charles VI would inherit not a throne, but a fragile mosaic of ambitions, rivalries, and fear. His father, Charles V, had been a shrewd and capable ruler, guiding France through the turmoil left by Edward III's intermittent invasions. Yet even the cleverest kings could not shield a child from the consequences of a Europe perpetually at war. When Charles V died in 1380, his son was merely 11 years old, too young to wield a sword, too inexperienced to hold the crown's heavy weight. The regency fell to his uncles, men whose loyalty was measured more by personal ambition than by devotion to their nephew. France became a court of intrigue, a chessboard on which noblemen moved pawns and captured pieces in pursuit of influence. The young king, meanwhile, was allowed the indulgence of youth. Hunting parties stretched for miles through snow-laden forests. Jousts and tournaments demanded courage and skill. And for a brief moment, the world seemed governed by sport and spectacle rather than blood and strategy. Chroniclers whisper hints of his other appetites: lusty, energetic, and insatiable. At 16, he married the 14-year-old Isabel of Bavaria. Their union was a tapestry of political necessity and youthful naivety, a marriage meant to produce heirs while binding alliances. By the time Charles reached 20, Isabel had borne him 12 children, ensuring the continuity of the Valois line. Yet the responsibilities of kingship, though pressing, remained distant from the young monarch's immediate passions. It was in the summer of 1392, under a sun that burned unusually hot even for July, that Charles's life began to fracture in ways unseen by historians for centuries. Attempting to assert his authority during a campaign against the Duke of Brittany, he fell prey to a strange and violent illness. Reports describe him speaking incoherently, attacking his own men, and moving as if possessed by a force beyond his control. In the open plains near Le Mans, a simple accident, a dropped lance, ignited chaos in his mind. He drew his sword, believing his companions to be enemies, and struck with deadly precision, killing at least one of his closest knights before collapsing in exhaustion. For 2 days, he lay in a delirium, muttering nonsense, unrecognizable even to those who had known him since birth. The physicians called it an imbalance of the humors, blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, a theory inherited from the ancients. Guillaume de Jacini, aged 92, prescribed rest, nourishing food, and careful observation. These remedies, though rudimentary by modern standards, reflected the deepest medical knowledge of the time. Trepanning, drilling a hole into the skull, was attempted not out of cruelty, but out of desperate hope to release whatever dark spirits or excess moisture might torment the king's mind. Yet Charles was not merely sick, he was haunted. The illness would come in waves, each more violent than the last. At times, he wandered the corridors of his palace, shrieking that he was no longer Charles VI, no longer king, no longer the man who had fathered children and worn a crown. He defaced his coat of arms, refused to acknowledge his wife, and became a living symbol of fragility. In these episodes, the king who had once hunted deer in snowy forests became a man terrified of shattering, as though the very glass of his bones might splinter at the slightest touch. These early signs of mental disturbance created a vacuum of power. His uncles moved swiftly, asserting dominance while the king's mind wrestled with hallucinations and delusions. The kingdom teetered, a fragile structure balanced on the edge of ambition and fear. Charles's illness was not simply a private torment. It was a national calamity, leaving France vulnerable to internal factions and external enemies alike. Even in moments of lucidity, the specter of fragility remained. Charles would later claim, in episodes that would etch his name into history, that he was made of glass. He ordered iron rods sewn into his clothing to protect himself, refused to let servants touch him, and navigated his own chambers with the care of one traversing a field of landmines. It is tempting to imagine him as merely eccentric or paranoid, but the psychological intensity of these episodes reveals a man acutely aware of his own vulnerability, a king whose body betrayed him as much as his mind. France watched in terror and fascination. A monarchy, already besieged by war and plague, now faced a sovereign who might destroy himself or his subjects in moments of madness. And yet, life pressed on. Marriages, alliances, and political machinations did not pause for illness. The king's story, from its earliest chapters, was one of human fragility colliding with the relentless machinery of history. By the end of his first major illness, Charles had glimpsed a reality few would ever know. The precarious line between power and impotence, between presence and absence, between life and the fragile illusions that sustain it. The man who would become known as Charles the Mad was already marked, not only by the crown upon his head, but by the delicate, terrifying vulnerability that would define his reign. In this fragile moment, the stage was set. A kingdom teetered on the brink of chaos. A young king's mind wandered into shadows, and history began to bend under the weight of a mind that refused to be tamed. The tale of Charles VI had begun, not with the roar of conquest, but with the quiet, terrifying fragility of a boy who might not survive himself. By the early 1390s, the fragile thread of Charles VI's sanity began to fray with alarming regularity. What had started as a violent fever during a summer campaign became a recurring nightmare that haunted the king and the kingdom alike. Chronicles speak of him waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, whispering that invisible enemies had infiltrated his chambers. His servants, once attendants and confidants, became unwilling actors in a theater of delusion, forced to navigate the dangers of a mind that refused to distinguish between reality and menace. The summer of 1392 was merely the opening act. During that campaign in Brittany, a sudden panic seized Charles. The drop of a lance, the clanging of metal, even the rustling of leaves could trigger a violent outburst. He lashed out at knights and pages alike, convinced that betrayal lay in every shadow. By the time his attendants restrained him, bodies were bruised, furniture destroyed, and the air thick with the echo of his frenzied shouts. 2 days passed before he regained any semblance of consciousness, speaking only gibberish and wandering the palace halls as if lost in a dreamscape of fear and suspicion. His physicians, trained in the classical arts of humoral medicine, sought to balance the 4 fluids of the body: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. One recommended trepanning, a surgical act that drilled into the skull, to release supposed malignant spirits. Others prescribed diaphoretic medicines to induce sweating, powders made from crushed pearls, and enforced periods of prayer and isolation. Modern eyes might see desperation in these acts. Yet, in the medieval mind, they were legitimate interventions designed to wrest control from forces beyond human understanding. But the illness was not merely physiological, it was psychological. Charles began to manifest what would later be called the glass delusion, a condition virtually unheard of in Europe at the time. He declared himself made of brittle crystal, convinced that a careless touch could shatter him completely. To protect his fragile frame, he ordered iron rods sewn into the lining of his garments, avoiding even the lightest contact with courtiers or family. His movements became deliberate, cautious, and unnatural, as if each step might trigger catastrophic fracture. The delusion was more than a curiosity. It was a lens through which the king interpreted every interaction. Servants were no longer simple attendants. They were threats, conspirators, potential instruments of harm. Even his wife, Isabel of Bavaria, found herself at once intimate and alien, unable to penetrate the icy barriers his paranoia imposed. On some days, he would forget she existed entirely, denying marriage, children, and kingship alike. On others, he acknowledged her, yet treated her with a dangerous mixture of suspicion and resentment. In these moments, the fragility of France itself was mirrored in the fragility of its king. Power shifted with each relapse. His uncles, once marginalized during his brief periods of lucidity, seized authority, manipulating the council, the army, and the treasury. Civil unrest followed as factions aligned themselves with or against the king's ephemeral will. Courtiers whispered of sorcery, poison, and divine punishment. Some believed he was demon-possessed, others cursed by ancestral sins. Each explanation, whether rational or fantastical, underscored the profound vulnerability of the monarchy. One particularly harrowing episode occurred at the infamous Bal des Ardents in 1393. Charles and several nobles donned costumes of wild men, shaggy and grotesque, in an attempt to amuse and celebrate. Yet amusement turned to horror when a torch ignited one of the dancers. Flames spread rapidly, claiming lives and leaving survivors scarred. The king, protected only by the quick intervention of a duchess who threw her gown over him, witnessed death and disfigurement firsthand. The court was shaken. Fear became inseparable from festivity, and the fragile veneer of normalcy in the royal household cracked irreparably. Even at home, Charles's delusions governed behavior. He refused baths, neglected his linen for months, and, in fits of mania, destroyed valuable objects or urinated on noble garments. Yet there were moments of horrifying insight. When he recognized the onset of an episode and took precautions, removing daggers, instructing attendants to limit access, revealing a mind simultaneously trapped in terror and aware of its own danger. Such duality made him unpredictable, tragic, and terrifying. The political consequences were immediate and severe. The king's incapacitation allowed his uncles and other power brokers to manipulate the monarchy at will. France teetered on the edge of civil war, a tinderbox of noble rivalries and factional disputes. Beyond its borders, Henry V of England recognized opportunity in the chaos, eyeing French lands with renewed hunger. A king fractured in mind was a kingdom fractured in governance, a nation left vulnerable to internal collapse and foreign conquest alike. Despite his illness, Charles was not entirely removed from power. During lucid intervals, he resumed governance, issuing edicts, signing treaties, and attempting to assert authority. Yet these periods grew progressively shorter, while episodes of mania, depression, and delusion lengthened and intensified. Each relapse left the king weaker, the monarchy more precarious, and France closer to disintegration. By the end of this chapter of his life, Charles VI was no longer merely a king. He was a symbol, a fragile, haunted figure whose mind had become a battlefield. The Glass King, as history here would remember him, embodied both the vulnerability of human cognition and the perilous fragility of political authority. His story was not just a tale of madness, but a reflection of a kingdom itself, trembling under the weight of disease, war, and the inexorable march of fate. The fragile child who had inherited the crown at 11 had become a man whose own mind could betray him. And yet, even in this darkness, the wheels of history continued to turn. France would endure, but only because, as often in human affairs, fragility and resilience existed side by side. Charles VI's mind, glass-like and trembling, would shape the destiny of kings, kingdoms, and the future of the 100 Years' War itself. By the dawn of the 15th century, Charles VI's reign had become a kingdom of shadows. Lucid intervals grew fleeting, mere pauses between the storm of delusion and terror. The king's mind, once capable of measured judgment, now teetered constantly on the edge of collapse. Courtiers and physicians alike whispered of a sovereign imprisoned in his own psyche, a man who could alternately issue commands with the weight of kingship and descend into grotesque frenzy. The glass delusion, first glimpsed in the 1390s, evolved into something more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Charles believed not just that his bones were fragile, but that every part of him, his limbs, his heart, even his thoughts, was shatterable. He wore layers of iron sewn beneath fine fabrics, moved cautiously through halls, and avoided all touch, as though contact could reduce him to splinters. At times, he recoiled even from light breezes, certain they carried threats capable of cracking his brittle body. These psychological torments were mirrored by the kingdom itself. Power vacuums widened as his uncles, Philip the Bold, Louis of Orléans, and John, Duke of Berry, maneuvered for control. Alliances shifted with alarming speed. Every edict, every declaration, every act of governance became a negotiation among men who feared the king's unpredictability as much as they coveted his throne. France teetered on the edge of civil war, a fragile state caught between loyalty to a fractured monarch and the ambition of competing dynasts. Charles's marriage to Isabel of Bavaria, once politically strategic, deteriorated into estrangement and resentment. The queen became an observer of a nightmare, powerless to calm a husband who alternated between recognition and denial of her very existence. Rumors whispered of affairs and intrigue, of plots imagined and real, further destabilizing the court. Servants and nobles navigated an impossible terrain. A king who might embrace them in a lucid moment, then lash out violently in the next. Meanwhile, beyond France's borders, England's ambitions loomed ominously. Henry V, a king whose military prowess was as ruthless as his timing, recognized opportunity in Charles's instability. The fractured French court could not present a united front. In 1415, Henry's army landed on French soil, encountering a kingdom divided and a monarch incapable of decisive command. The result was the Battle of Agincourt, a catastrophic defeat that shattered the French army and humiliated the monarchy on the world stage. Tens of thousands of soldiers died, noble families were decimated, and France's credibility as a unified power teetered. Charles VI, by then fully consumed by his delusions, could do nothing. He witnessed the destruction of his realm from a distance, both physically and mentally. Courtiers shielded him, carried messages, and attempted to stabilize his erratic moods. But the king remained a symbol of fragility. Each episode of madness reinforced the vulnerability of the monarchy. A ruler who could not protect himself could scarcely protect a kingdom. Yet even amid the chaos, traces of humanity persisted. During brief lucidity, Charles returned to religious observances, gave thanks in cathedrals, and attempted to exercise authority, however tenuously. These moments, stark against the backdrop of delusion, reveal a mind still aware of responsibility, trapped in a body and psyche that refused compliance. They hint at the profound tragedy of a king who desired to govern but was undone by forces beyond mere political rivalry, forces embedded in his own biology and psychology. As the years passed, the patterns of his illness deepened. He would run through palace corridors, shrieking of imagined enemies, or remain prostrate for weeks, refusing nourishment and neglecting hygiene, leaving skin diseases and lice in his wake. Objects of value were destroyed in fits of mania. Servants were abused or coerced. The simplest gestures could provoke terror. Physicians experimented with shock therapies, blackened men introduced to frighten him from self-neglect, powders and medicines designed to rebalance humors, rituals that mixed superstition with science. None could offer a cure. Yet all were testimony to the desperation surrounding the fragile monarch. France itself became a mirror of Charles's mind. Factions, civil unrest, and foreign invasions mirrored the king's instability. Every political move, whether by his uncles, his brother Louis, or his estranged queen, was influenced by the shadow of his madness. In this landscape, personal tragedy and national crisis intertwined. A kingdom's survival depended on a king who could no longer consistently inhabit reality. By 1422, the king's life drew to a somber close. He fell ill with quartan fever, a severe malarial infection, compounded by decades of physical and mental strain. Death arrived quietly, weeks after Henry V's own demise, leaving a kingdom poised on the knife edge of succession. Charles VI's grandson, Henry VI of England, inherited claims to both the English and French thrones, a child ruler for a fractured realm, a fitting coda to the chaos that had marked Charles's life. The story of Charles VI is a tale of fragility, personal, psychological, and political. He was a man haunted by delusions that made touch a danger and existence itself a threat. He was a king whose incapacity invited civil war and foreign conquest. And yet, even in madness, there lingered a tragic dignity, a recognition, fleeting but real, of the responsibilities he bore and the kingdom he could not save. His life reminds us that the line between power and impotence is perilously thin, and that the mind of a king, like the throne he occupies, can be both magnificent and terribly fragile. Charles VI's legacy would endure not only in history books, but in the psychological and cultural imagination. The Glass King, a sovereign who shattered under the weight of his own mind, whose reign intertwined human vulnerability with the fate of a nation. His story, dark and unsettling, echoes through the centuries, a reminder that even kings are mortal, and that madness can be as consequential as war. The summer of 1422 arrived with a cruel irony. Charles VI, the king who had lived decades in the shadow of his own fragile mind, succumbed to quartan fever, a malady as relentless as the political chaos that had marked his reign. For years, he had been haunted by visions, delusions, and violent frenzy. For decades, his kingdom had been held hostage by a monarch who could not fully inhabit his own body or mind. Now death arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, leaving France poised on a precipice of uncertainty. With Charles's passing, the throne became a contested and fractured prize. His grandson, Henry VI of England, was proclaimed heir to both England and France. A child king whose claim, though legitimate in law, was resented by French nobles. Factions immediately realigned, old rivalries reignited, and the country teetered once more on the brink of civil war. The crown that Charles had inherited at 11 and struggled to maintain through madness now passed to an infant, leaving the kingdom in peril yet again. Amid the turmoil, a figure emerged who would change the course of French history. Joan of Arc, a young woman of uncommon conviction, would rally the French people and restore hope to a kingdom that had long been paralyzed by fear and political instability. Under her guidance, Charles VI's disinherited son, Charles VII, would eventually ascend to the throne, earning the title Charles the Victorious. The battles waged by this new king, buoyed by what contemporaries described as divine intervention, reversed much of the damage wrought by decades of internal strife and external aggression. Yet the shadow of Charles VI lingered. His reign had exposed the fragility of monarchy. A single ruler's mind could determine the fate of millions. Every episode of madness had left ripples. Uncles seizing power, nobles maneuvering for advantage, foreign armies exploiting weakness. Agincourt, the humiliating defeat at the hands of Henry V, and the subsequent occupation of French lands were all consequences of a king who, despite moments of lucidity, could not consistently command. His illness had been both personal and national, a force that shaped wars, succession, and the destiny of a people. History often remembers Charles VI as the Mad King, a label that obscures the profound complexity of his life. His delusions, particularly the infamous glass delusion, were not mere eccentricities, but expressions of a mind under extreme strain, a psyche wrestling with fear, responsibility, and the inescapable weight of kingship. In this, he was tragically human, a ruler who could govern in theory, yet was incapacitated by the very qualities that made him human: fragility, vulnerability, and imagination. The lessons of Charles VI extend beyond his era. They reveal the precarious balance between power and sanity, the interplay of individual psychology and collective destiny, and the ways in which a single mind can become a fulcrum on which history pivots. His life, punctuated by violence, delusion, and suffering, also illuminates the resilience of a nation. France endured, rebounded, and ultimately reclaimed its sovereignty. Not in spite of the Glass King, but in part because his fragility had forced the country to confront its vulnerabilities and rise above them. Charles VI's death marked the end of an era defined by fear, hallucination, and political chaos. Yet it also set the stage for a renewal, for the triumph of Charles VII and the eventual conclusion of the 100 Years' War. The Glass King, though broken, left a legacy as enduring as any victory. A stark reminder of the human cost of monarchy, the fragility of power, and the profound, often tragic consequences of a mind unmoored from reality. In the quiet aftermath, as France began the slow work of reconstruction, the story of Charles VI remained, a cautionary tale of fragility, madness, and the delicate threads upon which kingdoms are built. A king made of glass, yet indelibly etched into history, his reign continues to fascinate, horrify, and teach. For in his life, we glimpse the extraordinary tension between human vulnerability and the unyielding demands of power, and the dark, haunting truth that even kings can shatter.